Hello, guys. For my volunteer experience, I ended up going to TREAT. TREAT is a program that Tarleton has in which horses are used to assist with therapy. The patients or clients most of the time start off by riding with a person in front and either one or two people on the sides with only one person on each side. Some people I noticed, however, were scared to ride the horses, especially if it was their first time, and so other steps were taken to ease them into it. Sometimes they would merely brush the horse with someone else helping them and teaching them how to brush him, and other times they're even allowed to walk the horse while someone was walking next to him in order to supervise. When I was younger, I used to train horses with my dad, but eventually we stopped doing that, and so I actually hadn't worked with horses in 6 or more years. And so that in itself made me very, very nervous at first. I also noticed Shelby, who was the person in charge of TREAT, as well as the other student workers, were a little bit wary about what jobs I was given at first and how much freedom I was given with the horses and with the patients, just because they didn't know how well I would react to working with horses. At the beginning, this actually made me feel a little disconnected from the group, especially because they all knew each other from working together and from being in classes together. I, on the other hand, had never really taken an ag or an equine class before, and I didn't really even know anybody. And so, because of that, I could tell that they already had all sorts of connections, whereas I was essentially the new guy. In time, however, I did end up gaining their trust, and I even started connecting with more people that worked there as well as with a lot of other volunteers I would go. And it eventually got to the point to where I was even allowed to lead or be the lead walker with some of the patients. Overall, it was an amazing experience, and I've even considered continuing to help them out in future semesters. One of the things I loved about TREAT was the patients themselves. They all ranged in personalities and disabilities. Some had physical, some had mental, and some even had emotional disabilities. But they all ranged in personality and who they were and how they reacted, how they interacted with other volunteers, with other people who were um, at TREAT and other patients. And it was just really cool getting to know them. And one thing that this experience taught me is that the person is not their disability, and even each disability is on a spectrum. At first, I didn't know what to expect, and I thought it was going to all be really, really easy and just smooth. But that quickly changed when I had this writer who would not react to anything we told him. He was a little boy, no older than 6, but he didn't want to do anything we told him to do. We put him on the horse, but shortly after that, he refused to talk. He would refuse to play any of the therapeutic games that they have at TREAT. And he even started falling asleep after he had a temper tantrum. And he just, I guess, got so tired and was worn out from exhaustion from crying that he just started falling asleep on top of the horse. And this actually reminds me of one of the terms in the book, which is psychological reactance. It seemed that the more we told him to do something, the less he wanted to conform, and the more he refused to listen, as well as just the less he reacted to us, or I guess the more negatively he reacted. I didn't understand why at first, but later I found out he was actually at a foster home, and so maybe things weren't as peaceful as they should be for a kid his age. But it did teach me that maybe some kids act out not because they're just terrible kids, but maybe because of the social conditions they're in. And this is actually the next term I want to discuss, which is social conditions. At first, I had an expectation of how the patients were going to react, how I kind of sort of believed that they should behave, and it was all based on what their reason was for being there, so in short, their disability. I quickly learned that that was not the case. And not only that, but it made me wonder just what social conditions led to not only their behavior, but maybe to some of the disorders they had. Because there was one patient in particular who struggled with discerning between reality and imagination, and he would even tell us that a lot of the stuff he told us about wasn't his imagination. And it turned out he actually has schizophrenia. One thing he mentioned was abuse from his mother, which I don't know at the end of the day if this is true or not. But it made me wonder what social conditions he could have gone through that maybe turned on the gene for schizophrenia, like epigenetics talks about. And so it got me thinking about just what these people had gone through, what the patients were still going through, and what could have led to either emotional or maybe even mental disabilities. The third term I want to discuss is emotional and or impulsive aggression. This type of aggression is one that occurs with very little forethought and is driven mainly by impulsive emotions. This actually came into mind because last week I witnessed a girl who is autistic self harm. She couldn't be older than 4, but I guess just due to being on the spectrum, she became overstimulated and just began banging her head on the horse's shoulder. And it was really interesting because I'd never seen that in my life. I'd seen it in maybe movies and videos, but I'd never actually witnessed it firsthand. And I actually even grew up with a kid who is on the spectrum, and I never even suspected he was just because he never reacted in this way. Um, I wasn't the one in like walking with the girl or being a sidewalker or the lead walker, so I got to actually witness it all firsthand just from the sidelines. But it was actually informative and really, really interesting because shortly after she reacted this way, I got to witness how they tried calming her down, how they tried either stimulating her in other ways or distracting her. Because this girl was no older than 4 and she didn't really talk. And eventually they did calm her down enough to where they were able to get her off the horse. But it was a ride that ended shortly because her mom saw the way she was reacting, and she would calm down for little periods, but then she'd start banging her head on the horse again. And so eventually the mom just said to get her off. But her reactions were just very impulsive. They were very aggressive towards herself, and so it made me think of this term because there was no warning. She just suddenly started crying and banging her head, and there was just very little thought or reaction. But not all the stories and all the cases that I witnessed were this aggressive or this sad, or they all didn't just end there. Like even the little boy who at first we couldn't get to react eventually bonded with one of the volunteers, and this volunteer actually got the boy to even smile and say thank you at the end of the ride. It was just really cool to see how this kid who would not react and who would just cry and even pass out on the horse changed from that kid to a kid who was actually having fun, smiling, interacting, and even taking part in some of the games. And just like how this volunteer had that bond with this kid, I eventually started to notice that I was kind of making bonds with some of the patients, especially when I would miss one day, and so I'd have to go in a different day, which meant I didn't see them for that week. And then once I did see them, they would tell me that, hey, they would tell me that they missed me, or they would ask me why I wasn't there, and they would tell me that I needed to be there and things like that. Sometimes they didn't really speak, but you could tell they were happy to see you because of the way they reacted, the mannerisms that they had. And it was just really cool seeing how I myself began bonding with some of the patients. Um, Eventually, the staff even became friendlier towards me. I started forming bonds with them as well. And Shelby and all the other staff workers would always tell me, "Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for volunteering." So eventually, I no longer felt disconnected, and that was really cool. Um, One thing that I feel that I am going to take from this whole experience is the fact that I learned that people are not their disability. Like I said earlier, um, I learned that you just have to treat them like any other person, and especially with respect and dignity, and to just not have any preconceived notions about what they're going to be like or how they're going to behave, how they're going to react to certain things, and to just go in with a blank slate and just treat them like any other person. And this actually reminds me of the last term I want to talk about, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this was talked about in the social problems text when it talked about finding ourselves and just different identity groups. People with disabilities are actually one of the more recent identity groups the text talked about, and it's one that has been heavily discriminated against. Thankfully, President George W. Bush signed the ADA in a law which prohibits the commercial, educational, or employment discrimination against people with disabilities. Unfortunately, many people still have preconceived notions about people with disabilities, like I did at first with the whole having expectations of how they're going to react. And this is what leads to discrimination. this experience, like I mentioned earlier, taught me not to think that way. And because of this, I think more people should volunteer, not just at Treat, but in all sorts of organizations. I think that it would eventually lead to a better understanding of different identity groups, cultures, social, economic classes, and eventually I think discrimination would be diminished, and we could just help how to learn, we could learn how to help each other a lot more. And so, yeah, that was my experience with Treat. Thank you.